there's a particular kind of terror that sits differently than others. Not the fear of pain, not even the fear of death itself, but the fear of waking up after everyone believes you're gone. The fear of opening your eyes in absolute darkness, of realizing the weight above you is earth, and the wooden walls around you were meant to be your final resting place. This isn't the stuff of nightmares. For much of human history, this was a rational, documented concern. So rational, in fact, that in the 18th and 19th centuries, people invented elaborate systems to prevent it. Bells attached to strings, breathing tubes, even spring-loaded coffin lids. Before we go deeper into this, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. So here's the question we're exploring today. Why did entire societies become obsessed with the idea of being buried alive? And what does that fear say about the strange, fragile boundary between life and death? A boundary that until very recently was far blurrier than we'd like to admit. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just the coffin bells and safety mechanisms, but the medical realities that made this fear reasonable, the cultural responses that varied across continents, and the technological advances that finally put this particular terror to rest. You'll see how a society's deepest anxieties shape its rituals, its laws, and its relationship with mortality itself. Let's start with the scope of this fear. This wasn't a niche phobia affecting a handful of anxious individuals. In Victorian Europe and America, the terror of premature burial was so widespread it had its own medical name, taphophobia, from the Greek taphos, meaning grave. Newspapers regularly published alleged accounts of exhumations where scratch marks were found on the inside of coffin lids, or bodies discovered in positions suggesting struggle. Whether all these accounts were true is debatable, but the fact that people believed them, shared them, obsessed over them, tells us something profound. The fear peaked during an era of particular medical uncertainty. This was a time when doctors diagnosed death primarily through observation. No pulse, no breath visible on a mirror, no response to painful stimuli. But here's the problem. Several medical conditions could mimic these signs. Catalepsy, certain types of comas, extreme hypothermia, drug overdoses, even some forms of epileptic seizure could produce a death-like state. The person appeared dead by every test available, yet somewhere inside, life persisted at a level too subtle for 19th century medicine to detect. Consider what this meant practically. Someone could suffer a cataleptic episode, be examined by a doctor who found no heartbeat with the crude instruments of the time, be declared dead, and be buried within a day or two, which was standard practice before embalming became common, especially in warm climates. If they regained consciousness hours later, they would wake to every claustrophobe's ultimate nightmare, with no realistic possibility of escape. The documented cases are fewer than folklore suggests, but they exist. In 1896, a Massachusetts man named T.M. Montgomery was declared dead after a riding accident. During his funeral, a friend noticed his eyelid flutter. Montgomery survived. In 1905, a French woman named Madame Bobin was saved when cemetery workers heard muffled sounds from her grave during a burial in an adjacent plot. Not everyone was so fortunate. When cholera swept through European cities, rapid mass burials were necessary for public health. And in that haste, mistakes certainly occurred, though precise numbers are impossible to determine. But perhaps the most haunting aspect wasn't the confirmed cases. It was the ambiguous ones. Exhumed bodies sometimes showed signs that disturbed investigators. Coffins with the lining torn, fingernails embedded with wood splinters, corpses found face down or twisted. Medical professionals debated whether these were signs of premature burial or simply the natural effects of decomposition and the settling of limbs after rigor mortis faded. The uncertainty itself fed the fear. This brings us to a deeper truth. The fear of premature burial wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the absolute loss of control, the horror of being mistaken, misunderstood, and abandoned by the living world while still being part of it. It was about the breakdown of trust in doctors, in family members to wait long enough, in your own body to clearly signal its status. In an era when medicine was rapidly advancing but still far from perfect, people were caught between the old certainties of death and the new uncertainties that knowledge brought. The question that haunted thousands was simple. How can you be sure? How can you absolutely, definitively know that the person lying still before you has truly crossed that boundary? And if you can't be certain, if there's even a 1% chance of error, what precautions are worth taking? This question would lead to some of the most ingenious, desperate, and occasionally absurd inventions in the history of death culture. But it would also lead to genuine medical progress, forcing doctors to develop better diagnostic tools and societies to create new death protocols. The fear of premature burial, for all its morbid character, pushed humanity toward a more precise understanding of what death actually is. So we're left with this, an entire era of humans standing at the edge of mortality, trying to draw a clear line where nature had created a gradient. They couldn't quite trust their doctors, couldn't quite trust their own perceptions, and so they created systems, bells, tubes, waiting periods, watchers, to guard against the unspeakable possibility. In doing so, they revealed something essential about what it means to be human. We are the species that knows death is coming, and we are the species that will go to extraordinary lengths to ensure it comes at the right time, in the right way, and with absolute certainty. The history of determining death is, in many ways, the history of human error. For thousands of years, death seemed obvious. You stopped breathing, your heart stopped beating, your skin grew cold. But as medical knowledge expanded, doctors began to realize something uncomfortable. The line between life and death wasn't nearly as clear as it appeared. Let's start with how death was actually diagnosed before modern technology. A physician or family member would hold a mirror or piece of glass near the person's mouth and nose, watching for condensation from breath. They'd place a feather near the nostrils to detect any movement of air. They'd feel for a pulse at the wrist or neck, though without precise timepieces or sensitive enough touch, a very weak or irregular heartbeat could easily be missed. They might hold a candle flame near the person's eye to see if the pupil would contract. In some traditions, they'd tie a string around a finger to see if swelling occurred over hours, the theory being that circulation had truly stopped. These methods weren't foolish for their time. They were the best available tools, but they were dangerously imprecise, and doctors knew it. The problem was that several medical conditions could create a state so similar to death that even trained physicians couldn't tell the difference with 18th or 19th century diagnostic capabilities. Catalepsy was perhaps the most feared of these conditions. This neurological disorder causes the body to become rigid and unresponsive, with breathing and heartbeat slowing to barely detectable levels. A person in a cataleptic state might remain frozen in whatever position they were in when the episode began, their muscles locked, their consciousness either completely suspended or trapped inside an unresponsive body. Episodes could last hours or even days. To someone checking for vital signs with crude methods, a cataleptic patient could appear completely dead. No visible breath, no detectable pulse, cool skin, fixed stare. Comas presented similar diagnostic challenges. Depending on the depth and cause, a comatose person might have such shallow breathing and such a weak heartbeat that they'd register as dead by the standards of the time. Certain poisons and drug overdoses, particularly opiates and sedatives, could slow all vital functions to a near imperceptible level. Extreme hypothermia does the same thing. The body essentially shuts down to conserve energy, and someone frozen to near death can appear completely lifeless until slowly and carefully rewarmed. Then there were conditions we now recognize as epileptic in nature. After certain types of seizures, a person enters what's called a postictal state, a period of deep unresponsiveness where they might not react to any stimulus for extended periods. Without understanding the neurological basis, observers would see only that the person had convulsed violently and then became utterly still and cold. The cholera epidemics that swept through Europe and America in the 19th century created particularly dangerous conditions for misdiagnosis. Cholera could produce a state called cholera collapse. The patient would become cold, blue-tinged, pulseless, and apparently lifeless, yet sometimes they would recover if given time and supportive care. But during epidemic outbreaks, when deaths were occurring by the hundreds daily and public health demanded rapid burial to prevent spread, the time needed to be absolutely certain wasn't always available. Here's where the medical reality became truly frightening. The diagnostic gap lasted for centuries. From ancient times through most of the 19th century, doctors had no definitive way to confirm death. They could only look for signs and make educated guesses. The invention of the stethoscope in 1816 by René Laennec was a significant advance. It allowed doctors to listen more carefully for heartbeats. But even this wasn't foolproof. A heart beating very slowly or irregularly could still be missed. The stakes of this uncertainty were enormous, and the medical profession knew it. In 1740, the French anatomist Jacques Benigne Winslow published a treatise titled The Uncertainty of the Signs of Death, which documented numerous cases of near burials and warned physicians to be more cautious. In 1895, the British Medical Journal published guidelines recommending that doctors observe bodies for at least 24 hours before certifying death, acknowledging that immediate diagnosis could be unreliable. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from the testimonies of those who nearly experienced premature burial themselves. These accounts, while sometimes embellished in newspaper retellings, revealed the terrifying subjective experience of being conscious but unable to signal life. Some people who recovered from cataleptic states reported being fully aware during their episode, hearing conversations, feeling examinations, experiencing absolute terror, but being completely unable to move, speak, or open their eyes. Imagine being in that state during your own funeral preparations. The documented cases of actual premature burial are difficult to verify with certainty, but enough credible accounts exist to confirm this wasn't purely folklore. In some instances, cemetery workers installing a new grave heard sounds from adjacent plots and, upon investigation, found someone still alive. In other cases, Family members insisted on viewing the body one more time before burial and noticed subtle signs of life, a warmth, a color, a barely perceptible breath that others had missed. More disturbing were the findings from exhumations, which occasionally occurred when families wanted to move remains to a new cemetery or when land was being repurposed. While many of the stories about scratch marks inside coffins are likely apocryphal or misinterpreted, bodies do shift during decomposition. There were enough troubling findings to sustain the public's fear. Bodies found in unnatural positions, coffin linings torn, evidence suggesting movement after burial. Whether these were genuine cases of premature burial or natural post-mortem phenomena, the ambiguity itself was enough to terrify. The medical establishment struggled with this problem because it struck at the heart of their authority and competence. Doctors were supposed to be able to tell the living from the dead. It was perhaps the most fundamental diagnostic task. The fact that they sometimes couldn't, that the tools and knowledge weren't adequate, created a crisis of confidence. Some physicians responded by advocating for longer observation periods. Others pushed for more reliable tests. Some suggested that certain invasive procedures, like making a small incision to check for bleeding, which would indicate circulation, should be performed before burial. What's remarkable is how long this diagnostic uncertainty persisted. We're not talking about ancient or medieval medicine here. We're talking about the Victorian era, a time of rapid scientific advancement, industrialization, and technological innovation. Yet the simple question, is this person dead, remained frighteningly difficult to answer with certainty. It wasn't until the development of the electrocardiogram in the early 20th century, combined with advances in understanding brain death and the implementation of rigorous death certification procedures, that the medical profession could finally say, with near absolute confidence, yes, this person has died. The gap between apparent death and confirmed death, that dangerous gray zone where a person might be misidentified, was the space in which the entire fear of premature burial flourished. It was rational, medically grounded, and genuinely terrifying. People weren't being paranoid when they worried about coffin bells and safety mechanisms. They were responding logically to a real limitation of medical knowledge, a limitation that wouldn't be fully resolved for another century. When fear becomes widespread enough, it creates a market. And when that market involves mortality itself, inventors get creative. The solution that captured the popular imagination and gives this video its title was elegantly simple. Install a bell system in the coffin so that anyone who woke up underground could signal for help. But the actual implementations were far more elaborate, ingenious, and occasionally absurd than that simple description suggests. The basic concept appeared in various forms throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, but the designs became increasingly sophisticated as the fear intensified. The simplest version involved a string attached to the deceased person's hand or finger, running up through the soil to a bell mounted on the grave marker above. If the person woke and moved their hand, the bell would ring, theoretically alerting a cemetery caretaker or passerby that someone needed immediate rescue. But inventors quickly realized this design had serious flaws. What if no one was nearby to hear the bell? What if it rang during a storm and was mistaken for wind? What if the rope broke or became tangled during burial? So they began adding features, creating what became known as safety coffins, elaborate contraptions that seem almost steampunk in their mechanical complexity. One of the most famous designs came from Count Michel de Karnus-Karnicki, a Polish nobleman who patented his device in 1897. His invention was triggered by the slightest movement of the chest or limbs. A spring-loaded mechanism would pop open a tube extending above ground, allowing air to rush in. Simultaneously, it would raise a flag, ring a bell, and even ignite a small explosive charge to attract maximum attention. The Count was so confident in his design that he demonstrated it publicly, having himself temporarily buried while observers watched the mechanism function. His device was actually installed in some European cemeteries, though exactly how many remains uncertain. The German inventor, Franz Wester, created perhaps the most elaborate safety coffin in 1868. His burial case included not just a bell and breathing tube, but an entire escape system. A ladder was built into the coffin, leading to a trap door in the ceiling. If the person woke, they could theoretically climb out on their own. The breathing tube was large enough to provide sustained air supply, and the bell system was connected to a small box on the surface that contained food and water, which could be lowered down through the tube if the person was too weak to climb immediately. Wester's design acknowledged a grim reality. Even if you woke up and signaled, rescue might take time, and you'd need to survive until help arrived. Other inventors focused on detection rather than rescue. Some designs incorporated glass panels in the coffin lid, positioned over the face, so that cemetery workers could check for signs of life without exhumation. Others included air pipes with strategically placed mirrors, allowing observers above ground to watch for breath condensation. Some featured mechanical indicators that would register any movement: a tilting platform, a balanced weight, a suspended flag that would fall if the body shifted even slightly. In Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, inventors created coffins with internal ropes connected to sets of chimes or multiple bells with different tones, theorizing that if the person could manipulate the rope with intention, they could create a pattern of rings that clearly indicated consciousness rather than accidental movement from decomposition gases or settling. The American inventor, Timothy Clark Smith, a physician who suffered from severe taphophobia, designed his own tomb in 1893 in Evergreen Cemetery, New Haven, Vermont. Smith's tomb featured a cement tube rising from his coffin to the surface, with a thick glass viewing port at grave level. He was buried with a bell in his hand, connected to the surface, and the glass allowed groundskeepers to look directly down at his face to verify death. The tomb still exists today, though the glass is now obscured by condensation and soil, a slightly eerie monument to one man's consuming fear. But here's the critical question: did these devices actually work? Were they actually implemented widely? The answer is more complicated than you might expect. Patents were filed for dozens of safety coffin designs throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in the United States and Europe. This tells us inventors saw commercial potential. They believed people would pay for these systems, and some certainly did. Wealthy individuals occasionally specified in their wills that safety mechanisms must be installed in their coffins, and undertakers did install these systems at considerable expense. However, widespread adoption never really happened. Most cemeteries didn't require or routinely install coffin bells. The systems were expensive, mechanically complex, and in many cases, impractical. A rope running through 6 feet of soil and dirt would quickly rot or become blocked. bells exposed to weather would corrode, mechanisms would fail, and perhaps most importantly, as embalming became standard practice in the late 19th century, the entire concern became moot. Embalming definitively ensures death in a way that no diagnostic test of the era could match. There are very few documented cases of coffin bells actually saving someone from premature burial. In fact, historians have found virtually no verified instances of the bell systems functioning as intended in an actual emergency. Cemetery workers did occasionally report hearing bells ring, but in most cases, these were attributed to natural causes: ground settling, animals disturbing the mechanisms, rope tension releasing as it decomposed, or gases from decomposition creating movement inside the coffin. This creates a fascinating psychological dynamic. The safety coffins provided comfort more than actual safety. They were a ritual object, a talisman against fear, rather than a practical solution. People knew intellectually that the chances of waking up in a coffin were very small, but the horror of that possibility was so extreme that even a symbolic protection felt necessary. It's similar to carrying a good luck charm. You know logically it probably won't help, but the psychological comfort is real and valuable. The safety coffin business reveals something profound about how humans respond to low probability, high horror scenarios. We're not good at rational risk assessment when extreme outcomes are involved. The actual statistical risk of premature burial was always quite low, even in the era before modern diagnostics. But the emotional weight of that risk, the sheer terror of the imagined experience, was so heavy that it outweighed statistical reality. People were willing to spend significant money on elaborate mechanical systems that probably wouldn't work, just to feel they'd done something, anything, to prevent the unthinkable. Undertakers and cemetery operators found themselves in an ethical gray area. Some genuinely believed they were providing a valuable service and peace of mind. Others undoubtedly exploited the fear, marketing increasingly expensive and elaborate systems to anxious clients. Patent applications from the era sometimes read like modern infomercials, emphasizing the horror of premature burial and positioning the inventor's particular mechanism as the only real solution. What's remarkable is the sheer variety of approaches. Some inventors focused on prevention, better diagnostic tools to ensure death before burial. Others focused on detection, ways to check on the buried after the fact. Still others focused on rescue, providing air, escape routes, and signaling methods. And a final category focused on what might be called humane endings. Some designs included poison tablets or weapons inside the coffin, allowing the awakened person to end their suffering quickly rather than dying slowly of suffocation. The coffin bell, then, represents both human ingenuity and human anxiety working in tandem. It shows us trying to engineer our way out of existential dread, trying to impose control and rational systems on something fundamentally beyond our control, the boundary between life and death. These mechanisms were built by people who understood uncertainty, who lived in an era when medicine was advancing rapidly but incompletely, who knew just enough to be frightened, but not enough to be sure. And in a strange way, they worked. Not mechanically, but psychologically. They allowed people to face death with slightly less terror, knowing they'd taken precautions. They represented hope, agency, and human creativity in the face of our oldest fear. Whether they ever rang when they needed to is almost beside the point. The fear of premature burial wasn't uniquely Western. but the responses to it varied dramatically across cultures, revealing different philosophies about death, different levels of medical infrastructure, and different relationships between the living and the dead. While Europeans were patenting mechanical coffin bells, other societies were developing their own solutions, some technological, some ritualistic, some simply rooted in tradition. Let's start with the European aristocracy, where the fear reached perhaps its most extreme expression. Wealth meant options, and terrified nobles exercised those options in increasingly elaborate ways. Some demanded in their wills that their throats be cut after death, ensuring that even if diagnosis was wrong, they wouldn't wake up. Others required decapitation, or that their hearts be pierced, or that their major arteries be opened. These weren't acts of mutilation, but of desperate certainty. They wanted death confirmed through means that left no possibility of error. The French Revolution aristocrat Madame Necker made her physician promise to dissect her after death, not for science, but for assurance. The Duke of Wellington requested a similar post-death procedure. Harriet Martineau, the English writer, left instructions that her head should be severed from her body. Frédéric Chopin was so terrified of premature burial that he begged his sister to have him cut open after death. She honored the request. His heart was removed and later taken to Warsaw, while his body was buried in Paris. These requests reveal an interesting class dimension. Wealthy individuals could demand medical interventions that confirmed death definitively. Poor families couldn't afford such luxuries. They relied on traditional waiting periods, communal death watches, and the passage of time, which, ironically, was often more reliable than hasty diagnosis, followed by elaborate safety mechanisms. In the United States, during the late 19th century, a different solution emerged: waiting mortuaries, sometimes called houses of death or vitae dubii asylum, shelters for those whose lives were doubtful. The concept originated in Germany, but found particular expression in America. These facilities kept recently deceased bodies under observation for days, sometimes weeks, with attendants monitoring them constantly for any signs of returning life. The bodies would be laid in temperature-controlled rooms, positioned so attendants could easily observe them. Some facilities attached strings to the corpse's fingers connected to bell systems, so any movement would alert staff. In more technologically advanced mortuaries, electrical sensors were used, primitive versions of modern vital sign monitors. The bodies remained there until clear signs of decomposition appeared, which provided absolute certainty that death had occurred. Frankfurt, Germany, operated one of the most famous waiting mortuaries, with a dedicated staff working in shifts around the clock. The facility was maintained into the early 20th century and featured separate rooms for different classes of deceased. Even in death observation, social hierarchy persisted. Munich and Berlin had similar institutions. In the United States, a few cities established waiting mortuaries, though they never became as widespread as in German-speaking regions. The waiting mortuary concept reveals a fascinating cultural difference. Rather than trying to enable communication from the grave, these societies chose to delay burial until certainty was achieved naturally. It was a more passive approach, but arguably more effective than mechanical bells that might or might not function. The psychological impact was different too. Families knew their loved ones were being watched over, cared for, kept in a liminal space until the transition was confirmed. Eastern European customs took yet another approach, one more deeply rooted in community ritual than technology. In many Slavic cultures, the tradition of sitting with the dead, sometimes called a death watch or vigil, served multiple purposes. Family members and community members would remain with the body continuously from death until burial, which typically occurred 3 days later. This wasn't primarily about fear of premature burial, but it provided that safeguard as a side effect. During these vigils, people would pray, tell stories, and maintain constant presence with the deceased. If the person showed any signs of life during this period, it would be immediately noticed. The 3-day waiting period became standardized in many Christian traditions, with theological significance related to Christ's resurrection, but it also provided practical insurance against premature burial. By the 3rd day, in most climates, decomposition would have begun, providing clear confirmation of death. In rural Russia and Ukraine, an additional practice involved placing specific objects with the body that would indicate movement. A glass of water might be balanced carefully, or seeds scattered in specific patterns around the corpse. Any disturbance would be immediately visible to the watchers. These weren't mechanical devices, but observational tools, using the same basic principle as the coffin bells, but through direct human attention rather than automated mechanisms. Jewish burial customs traditionally required rapid burial, ideally within 24 hours of death, which might seem to increase the risk of premature burial. However, the practices around preparation of the body provided multiple checkpoints. The washing and dressing of the deceased was performed by community members specifically trained for this role, and any signs of life would be detected during this intimate handling. Additionally, the body was never left alone from death until burial. Someone remained with it at all times, reciting psalms and prayers. This constant presence served as an organic safety system. In some Sephardic Jewish communities, particularly in Mediterranean regions, there was an additional practice of checking for signs of death by placing a feather under the nose or a mirror near the mouth, similar to European medical practices, but performed by family members as part of religious ritual rather than as medical diagnosis. The community-based nature of death care meant multiple people would observe the body at different times, reducing the chance that one person's mistake would result in premature burial. Islamic burial practices similarly emphasize rapid burial, typically within 24 hours, but with intensive preparation that involves washing the entire body and wrapping it in burial shrouds. The physical handling required for proper preparation serves as an extended examination period. Additionally, Islamic tradition includes placing the deceased on their right side facing Mecca, a positioning that requires careful adjustment of the body and would likely reveal any signs of remaining life. In China and other parts of East Asia, the approach to death timing was markedly different from Western practices. Traditional Chinese customs often involved keeping the body at home for several days, sometimes weeks, while family members gathered and elaborate funeral preparations were made. The body might be placed in a sitting position in some traditions, and professional mourners or family members would maintain vigil. This extended period of observation, combined with the physical preparations for burial, made premature burial extremely unlikely. Additionally, some Chinese traditions involved consulting with spiritual practitioners to determine the auspicious timing for burial based on cosmic calendars and the deceased's birth details. While the motivations were spiritual rather than medical, The effect was that burial often occurred only after enough time had passed for death to be absolutely certain. In India, Hindu cremation practices eliminated the possibility of premature burial entirely. Cremation occurs relatively quickly, often within 24 hours, but the process itself provides absolute confirmation of death. There's no ambiguity, no possibility of waking in a grave. In the rare cases where burial was used instead of cremation, the preparation rituals were extensive enough to serve as verification. What's striking across all these cultural variations is that societies without advanced medical technology often had more reliable safeguards against premature burial than societies with early mechanical interventions. The Western European approach of quick diagnosis, followed by elaborate safety mechanisms, was actually riskier than traditional practices involving extended observation, community death watches, and delayed burial. The role of social class appears in every culture. Wealthy individuals everywhere had access to better medical observation, could afford to delay burial in temperature-controlled environments, and could demand additional verification procedures. Poor families relied more on community practices and tradition, which often meant longer observation periods simply because they couldn't afford rapid professional burial services. In regions with hot climates, much of Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East and Mediterranean, the practical concerns of rapid decomposition forced faster burial timelines. But this was balanced by the fact that clear signs of death appeared more quickly. The body would cool rapidly, rigor mortis would set in unmistakably, and the physical changes of death would become obvious faster than in cooler climates. The environmental reality shaped the cultural practices. Perhaps the most telling difference is philosophical. Western societies, particularly during the Victorian era, approached the problem as something to be solved through technology and innovation. The coffin bell represents the mindset of engineering a solution, of human ingenuity conquering fear. Eastern and traditional societies more often approached it through time, patience, community involvement, and ritual, allowing nature to make death certain rather than trying to create artificial certainty. Neither approach was perfect. Traditional waiting periods occasionally delayed burial longer than necessary, creating emotional distress for families and practical challenges in some climates. Mechanical safety devices gave false security and rarely functioned as intended. But the cultural differences reveal contrasting relationships with death itself: control versus acceptance, individual versus communal, technological versus traditional. What united all these approaches was the underlying fear, which was genuinely universal. Whether you were a European count demanding decapitation, a German family sending your loved one to a waiting mortuary, or a Slavic village maintaining 3 days of vigil, the concern was the same: ensuring that death was real, that the boundary had truly been crossed, that no one would wake in darkness with earth above them. Different cultures, different solutions, same fundamental human terror. The fear of premature burial wasn't just a private anxiety whispered about in bedrooms. It became a full-fledged cultural phenomenon, a recognized medical condition, and eventually a thriving industry. Understanding how this fear evolved from reasonable medical concern to near-mass hysteria requires looking at the broader landscape of death anxiety in the 19th century and the various forces that amplified and exploited it. Tapophobia, the clinical term for fear of being buried alive, was formally recognized by medical professionals in the late 1800s. The word comes from the Greek taphe, meaning grave or tomb, and phobos, meaning fear. But unlike many phobias that are considered irrational, taphophobia occupied a strange middle ground. Doctors acknowledged that while extreme cases represented pathological anxiety, a moderate concern about premature burial was actually rational given the diagnostic limitations of the era. Some individuals developed such severe taphophobia that it dominated their lives. They would make elaborate will provisions, spend enormous sums on safety mechanisms, refuse to sleep in enclosed spaces, or even avoid situations where they might lose consciousness. The physician, Timothy Clark Smith, who had that windowed tomb built in Vermont, represents an extreme case. His fear was so consuming that even after death, his arrangements reflected it. His tomb, with its viewing tube and bell system, was less about practical safety and more about psychological necessity, a permanent monument to his inability to trust death's finality. The medical establishment's response to taphophobia was complicated. On one hand, doctors recognized that their diagnostic tools were imperfect and that the fear had legitimate medical grounding. On the other hand, they saw how the anxiety could become pathological and wanted to reassure the public without admitting too openly to medicine's limitations. This created a delicate rhetorical balance in medical journals and public health communications. Some physicians advocated strongly for longer observation periods before burial. They published articles arguing that bodies should be kept for at least 48 to 72 hours before interment, with regular checks for vital signs. Others pushed back, arguing that this would create public health risks, especially during epidemic outbreaks, and that it unnecessarily prolonged the grief process for families. The debate revealed tensions within medicine itself about how to balance caution with practicality. But while doctors debated protocols, literature was pouring gasoline on the flames of public fear. Edgar Allan Poe's 1844 short story, The Premature Burial, became perhaps the most influential piece of writing on the subject. Poe, a master of psychological horror, crafted a narrative that wasn't about supernatural terror, but about the most realistic nightmare imaginable: waking in a coffin, feeling the wooden lid inches from your face, realizing the terrible mistake that has been made. The story's power came from its specificity and plausibility. Poe described real medical conditions that could mimic death. He recounted allegedly factual cases of premature burial. He walked readers through the physical sensations and psychological progression of someone waking underground. The story wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to terrify, and it succeeded brilliantly. It was widely reprinted, translated into multiple languages, and became part of the cultural consciousness of death anxiety. But Poe wasn't alone. Numerous other writers, journalists, and publishers found that premature burial stories sold newspapers and magazines. Victorian-era periodicals regularly published accounts, some verified, many exaggerated or entirely fabricated, of people being buried alive. Each story would include gruesome details: the scratch marks inside exhumed coffins, the bodies found in twisted positions, the bells that rang too late or went unheard. These accounts created a feedback loop. Readers would encounter a story about premature burial, which would increase their anxiety, which would make them more attentive to similar stories, which would encourage publishers to print more such content. The fear became self-reinforcing through media saturation. By the mid to late 1800s, Premature burial stories were a recognizable genre of sensational journalism, comparable to how modern media might cover plane crashes or shark attacks. Statistically rare events that receive disproportionate attention because of their dramatic nature. The amplification of fear through literature and journalism created business opportunities. Undertakers began offering safety burial packages as premium services. For additional fees, families could ensure their loved ones were buried with bell systems, breathing tubes, or in coffins with special internal mechanisms. Some funeral homes advertised their services specifically around premature burial prevention, using fear as a marketing tool. Patent offices were flooded with safety coffin designs. Between 1800 and 1900, dozens of patents were filed in the United States alone, with similar numbers in European countries. Each inventor claimed their mechanism was superior to previous designs, solving problems that earlier versions had overlooked. The patent applications themselves read like horror stories, opening with dramatic descriptions of the terror of premature burial before presenting the technical solution. Some entrepreneurs went further, offering subscription services for grave monitoring. For an annual fee, cemetery caretakers would check subscriber graves regularly, listening for bells and watching for flags. These services were marketed particularly to the wealthy, who could afford ongoing costs. Whether the monitoring was actually performed as promised is questionable, but the psychological comfort of having purchased the service was real. Insurance companies even got involved, though more peripherally. Some life insurance policies of the era included clauses related to burial procedures, and a few specialized policies offered coverage specifically for premature burial scenarios, though exactly what such a policy would pay out for and to whom was legally murky. The business of death security reveals the darker side of entrepreneurial capitalism. There were certainly inventors and undertakers who genuinely believed they were providing valuable services, but there were also clear opportunists who recognized a terrified market and exploited it. The more elaborate and expensive the safety mechanism, the more it suggested the seller understood the true scope of the danger, creating an arms race of increasingly complex and costly solutions to a problem that was always statistically minor. The medical establishment watched this commercialization with mixed feelings. Some doctors appreciated that it encouraged more careful death verification. Others worried it was creating unnecessary public panic and undermining confidence in medical diagnosis. A few physicians publicly criticized the safety coffin industry as exploitative, arguing that improved diagnostic protocols were the real solution, not mechanical contraptions. What's fascinating is how the anxiety reflected broader social changes. The 19th century was a period of rapid medical advancement, but also profound medical uncertainty. Doctors were learning that many of their traditional beliefs were wrong, that diseases had natural rather than supernatural causes, that the body was far more complex than previously understood. This explosion of knowledge created a paradox. People knew more about death than ever before, but that knowledge revealed how much they didn't know. The fear of premature burial also reflected changing relationships with death itself. In earlier centuries, death was more visible and more communal. People died at home, surrounded by family. Bodies were prepared by loved ones. The dying process was witnessed, and death, when it came, was generally obvious. But as medical institutions grew, as hospitals became places where people died, as professional undertakers replaced family preparation of bodies, death became more professionalized and more distant. This created a trust gap. People were now relying on strangers to determine if their loved ones were truly dead. Additionally, the Victorian era was characterized by intense social anxiety around control, propriety, and the body. The idea of losing control, of being mistaken for dead, of being unable to communicate one's state, was particularly horrifying to a culture that valued composure and self-determination. Premature burial represented the ultimate loss of agency, and in a society increasingly focused on individual rights and autonomy, this resonated deeply. The class dimensions of the fear are worth emphasizing. Wealthy individuals had the resources to indulge their anxieties through elaborate precautions. Middle-class families might scrimp and save to afford basic safety measures. Poor families had no such options and had to trust in traditional practices and hope. The fear of premature burial, like many fears, could be mitigated with money, and the marketplace organized itself accordingly. Religious communities responded to the cultural anxiety in various ways. Some clergy preached acceptance of death and trust in divine providence, arguing that excessive precautions suggested a lack of faith. Others were more sympathetic, acknowledging that reasonable precautions were appropriate and didn't contradict religious teachings. A few religious thinkers even developed theological frameworks for understanding premature burial. Was someone who woke in a grave still alive in the eyes of God, or had their soul already departed, leaving only the body to suffer? By the late 1800s, the fear of premature burial had become so culturally embedded that it appeared in everything from sermons to political cartoons to popular songs. It was referenced in novels, used as metaphor in poetry, and became shorthand for ultimate helplessness. The cultural saturation meant that even people who weren't particularly anxious about it were aware of the concept and had probably thought about it at least once. The phenomenon reveals something important about how societies process collective fears. When a genuine risk exists, even a small one, and when that risk involves extreme horror, human psychology tends to magnify it beyond its statistical reality. Add in media amplification, commercial exploitation, and the legitimizing voice of some medical professionals, and you get a self-sustaining cycle of anxiety that can persist for generations. Taphophobia and its cultural expression weren't irrational, but they were disproportionate. The actual risk of premature burial was always quite low. But the emotional calculus wasn't about probability. It was about the magnitude of the feared outcome. And in that calculus, even a tiny chance of waking underground was enough to justify almost any precaution, any expense, any elaborate ritual to prevent it. The fear of premature burial didn't disappear overnight. It faded gradually as multiple technological, medical, and social changes converged to make the concern obsolete. By the mid-20th century, coffin bells had become curiosities, and taphophobia had shifted from a rational medical concern to a recognized but uncommon psychological phobia. Understanding how this transition happened reveals how scientific advancement can genuinely resolve cultural anxieties, not just through reassurance, but through fundamental changes in practice. The first major breakthrough came with advances in diagnostic technology. The stethoscope, invented in 1816, was an important early step, but it wasn't until the device became standardized and widely used in the latter half of the 19th century that it significantly improved death diagnosis. A skilled physician using a quality stethoscope could detect even faint heartbeats that would be missed by pulse checking alone. More importantly, they could listen over an extended period, giving time for very slow or irregular heartbeats to reveal themselves. But the real revolution came with the development of the electrocardiogram. Willem Einthoven created the first practical ECG machine in 1903, and while early versions were enormous, expensive devices found only in major hospitals, they represented a fundamental shift. For the first time, doctors could objectively measure electrical activity in the heart with precision that didn't depend on human perception. A flat line on an ECG provided certainty that no pulse checking or stethoscope listening could match. The ECG technology improved rapidly through the early 20th century, becoming more portable, more affordable, and more reliable. By the 1920s and 1930s, most hospitals in developed countries had access to ECG equipment, and by mid-century, it was standard practice to use electrical monitoring to confirm death in any uncertain cases. The diagnostic gap that had terrified previous generations was finally closing. Parallel to this, the understanding of brain death evolved. In the early 20th century, neurologists began recognizing that cardiac death and brain death weren't always simultaneous, and that the cessation of brain function was the more definitive marker of death. This led to new protocols for checking neurological responses: pupil dilation, reflex testing, response to painful stimuli, performed in systematic ways that went far beyond the crude tests of earlier eras. By the 1950s and 1960s, medical schools were teaching comprehensive death verification protocols that combined cardiac monitoring, neurological assessment, and observation of other vital signs. The multi-system approach meant that even if one indicator was ambiguous, others would provide clarity. The conditions that had fooled 19th century physicians, catalepsy, deep coma, extreme hypothermia, were now recognizable and distinguishable from actual death. But perhaps the single most significant change was the widespread adoption of embalming. The practice had ancient roots, but became standardized in America and Europe during and after the Civil War, when the need to preserve bodies for transport home from battlefields drove technical improvements. By the early 20th century, embalming had become routine practice for most deaths in developed countries. Embalming definitively ensures death in a way that no diagnostic test can challenge. The process involves draining blood from the body and replacing it with preservative chemicals, which requires making incisions in major arteries and veins. No one could survive this procedure. Even if somehow a diagnosis was wrong, even if someone was in the deepest possible coma or cataleptic state, the embalming process itself would end any remaining life. It was absolute, final, irreversible confirmation. The psychological effect of widespread embalming can't be overstated. Once families knew that their loved ones would be embalmed before burial, the entire fear of premature burial became moot. There was no longer any possibility, however remote, of someone waking up in a coffin. The embalmers themselves served as final verifiers of death, and the physical evidence of the procedure, the sutured incisions, the changed color and texture of the skin, provided visible confirmation to family members. Legal and regulatory changes accompanied these medical advances. Throughout the early 20th century, jurisdictions began requiring formal death certificates signed by licensed physicians with specific criteria that needed to be met before burial could proceed. These weren't informal assessments, but legal documents with professional liability attached. A doctor who incorrectly certified death could face serious consequences, which incentivized thoroughness. Many regions implemented mandatory waiting periods between death certification and burial, typically 24 to 48 hours, unless the family specifically requested immediate burial for religious reasons. This waiting period, combined with improved diagnostic tools, meant that any ambiguous cases had time to resolve. If someone was in a deep coma rather than dead, they would almost certainly show signs of life within that time frame. The professionalization of death care also played a role. Funeral homes became licensed businesses subject to regulatory oversight. Undertakers became trained professionals who understood medical signs of death and worked closely with physicians. The informal, sometimes hasty burial practices of earlier eras gave way to standardized procedures with multiple checkpoints. By mid-century, the entire system of death verification and burial had been rationalized and regulated in ways that eliminated the gaps where errors could occur. Refrigeration technology, which became common in funeral homes by the 1920s and 1930s, provided another safeguard. Bodies could be kept in temperature-controlled environments that slowed decomposition, allowing for extended observation periods without the sanitary concerns that had previously rushed burials in warm weather. If there was any doubt about death, the body could be refrigerated and monitored for days without health risk to others. The last installations of coffin bell systems are difficult to date precisely, but most historians place them in the early 1900s, with a few eccentric individuals requesting them as late as the 1920s or 1930s. By the 1940s, undertakers who were interviewed about the practice spoke of it as a historical curiosity from their father's or grandfather's time, not something anyone had requested recently. Patent filings for safety coffins also tell the story. They peaked in the 1880s and 1890s, declined sharply in the early 1900s, and had essentially ceased by the 1920s. The last few patents filed were often for variations on earlier designs rather than genuinely new concepts, suggesting inventors were trying to squeeze the last commercial potential out of a dying market. The cultural shift was equally important. As medical advances made premature burial practically impossible, the fear gradually lost its social legitimacy. What had been a reasonable concern discussed openly in polite society became first an eccentric anxiety, then a recognized phobia, and finally a historical curiosity. Literature stopped featuring premature burial stories as plausible horror. When the theme appeared in mid-20th century fiction, it was usually in period pieces or clearly fantastical contexts. The waiting mortuaries that had operated in German cities closed one by one through the early 20th century. Frankfurt's famous facility shut down in the 1890s as embalming became more common. Munich's lasted until around 1910. By the 1920s, the concept was obsolete. Bodies were kept in funeral home refrigeration or embalmed, making dedicated observation facilities unnecessary. Popular culture moved on to other fears. The anxieties that had focused on premature burial in the Victorian era found new objects in the 20th century. Fear of medical experimentation, fear of being kept alive artificially, fear of organ harvesting. The fundamental human anxiety about the boundaries of life and death persisted, but the specific manifestation of premature burial faded as medical reality made it implausible. There's a philosophical dimension to this transition worth considering. The fear of premature burial represented uncertainty about death itself, about where exactly the line was, about whether it was sharp or gradual, about whether the transition could be reversed or paused. Modern medicine essentially resolved this philosophical uncertainty through technology and procedure. Death became, if not simple, at least clear and verifiable. The ambiguity that had haunted previous generations was eliminated through objective measurement and irreversible interventions like embalming. This represents one of the rare cases where scientific and technological advancement genuinely solved a deeply rooted human fear, rather than just managing or suppressing it. The fear wasn't irrational, and it wasn't addressed through psychological treatment or cultural shift alone. It was addressed by making the feared scenario literally impossible through changes in medical practice. By the 1950s and 1960s, tapophobia had become a clinical diagnosis for a specific anxiety disorder, rather than a widespread cultural phenomenon. People who suffered from it were treated with therapy, not coffin bells. Medical textbooks discussed it as a historical example of how rational fears can become pathological when amplified by cultural factors and lack of scientific understanding. Today, the infrastructure of modern death care makes premature burial essentially impossible in developed countries. Multiple verification systems, legal requirements, professional standards, and the near-universal practice of embalming create overlapping safeguards that prevent the errors that terrified previous generations. Bodies are monitored, examined, legally certified, and physically altered in ways that ensure death before burial. The historical record of the last verified case of premature burial is murky, partly because by the time medicine had advanced enough to prevent such cases, it had also advanced enough to retrospectively question whether earlier verified cases were actually real or misattributed to other causes. The last widely believed case in medical literature dates to the early 1900s, but even those accounts are disputed. What remains of the coffin bell era are physical artifacts. The few surviving safety coffins in museums, Timothy Clark Smith's viewing window tomb in Vermont, patent drawings in archives, and a cultural memory of a time when the boundary between life and death was genuinely uncertain. These artifacts remind us that fears we might now consider irrational were once grounded in real medical limitations, and that technological progress can sometimes genuinely free us from terrors that haunted our ancestors. The fate of premature burial fear represents a quiet victory of human knowledge over human anxiety, achieved not through reassurance, but through fundamental transformation of death care practices. So what does this entire history, the coffin bells, the safety mechanisms, the waiting mortuaries, the cultural panic, teach us about being human? What wisdom can we extract from our ancestors' terror of waking beneath the earth? At its deepest level, the fear of premature burial reveals something fundamental about human consciousness. We are the only creatures who know we will die, and that knowledge creates a peculiar form of anxiety. We don't just fear death itself. We fear the transition, the boundary, the moment of crossing. We fear being trapped in between, neither fully alive nor fully dead. The coffin bell represents an attempt to maintain control over that transition, to keep one foot in the world of the living, even as we're being committed to the realm of the dead. This speaks to a broader truth about human nature. We are deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity, especially ambiguity about our own existence. We want clear categories: alive or dead, conscious or unconscious, here or gone. The medical reality of the 18th and 19th centuries was that these categories were fuzzy, that the boundary was actually a zone rather than a line. People could be mostly dead, but not entirely, could appear gone, but still be present. This violated our psychological need for certainty, and we responded by creating elaborate systems to impose clarity where nature had created gradients. The response to this ambiguity, the mechanical solutions, the cultural rituals, the legal frameworks, demonstrates something essential about how humans cope with existential threats. We build, we engineer, we create systems and procedures and devices that give us the illusion, or sometimes the reality, of control. Faced with the ultimate powerlessness of death, we invented strings and bells and breathing tubes, not because they were particularly effective, but because doing something felt better than doing nothing. There's profound dignity in this, actually. The coffin bell may seem absurd from our modern perspective, but it represents human creativity and determination in the face of terror. Our ancestors knew they couldn't prevent death, couldn't fully understand it, couldn't even reliably detect it, but they refused to simply accept that helplessness. They imagined solutions. They filed patents. They spent their money and time building systems that might, just possibly, save someone from the worst fate they could imagine. That's not foolishness. That's the human spirit insisting on agency, even in the most impossible circumstances. The cultural variations in responding to this fear teach us about the different ways humans create meaning around mortality. Some societies chose technology and individual solutions, personal bells, personal safety coffins, personal legal arrangements. Others chose community and ritual, collective death watches, shared waiting periods, communal responsibility for verifying death. Neither approach was objectively superior, but they reflected different values. The individual approach emphasized personal autonomy and the right to take your own precautions. The communal approach emphasized collective care and the idea that death isn't a private event, but a transition that affects and involves the entire community. What's striking is that the communal approaches were often more effective than the technological ones. A 3-day vigil with constant human presence was more reliable than a coffin bell that might malfunction or go unheard. This suggests something counterintuitive. Sometimes the old ways, the traditional practices, the rituals that seem primitive or superstitious, actually contain practical wisdom that gets lost when we try to engineer solutions. The coffin bell was more advanced than sitting with the dead for 3 days, but it was less functional. This history also reveals how societies create meaning through their anxieties. The fear of premature burial became a lens through which people understood death more broadly. It gave them something specific to focus on, something concrete to prevent. In a way, fixating on premature burial was easier than confronting the larger, more abstract terror of mortality itself. You can't really do anything about dying eventually, but you can install a bell in your coffin. The specific fear becomes a manageable proxy for the unmanageable existential dread. Literature and culture amplified the fear, but they also provided a way to process it. Reading Poe's story about premature burial was frightening, but it was also cathartic. It allowed people to experience the horror vicariously, in a controlled way, and perhaps feel they'd confronted and survived it. The proliferation of premature burial stories in Victorian media served a psychological function similar to how modern horror films allow us to experience fear safely. We need ways to face the things that terrify us most, and stories provide that opportunity. The commercial exploitation of the fear reveals something less noble about human nature: the willingness to profit from others' anxiety. But it also shows how market dynamics respond to genuine psychological needs. Some of the entrepreneurs selling safety coffins were certainly cynical opportunists, but others probably believed they were providing valuable peace of mind. The line between helpful service and exploitative fear-mongering is often blurry. Even today, entire industries exist around death anxiety. Life insurance, funeral planning, estate law, and we accept them as legitimate because they address real concerns. The Victorian coffin bell industry was fundamentally the same, just addressing a concern we've since resolved. Perhaps the most important lesson is about how knowledge changes fear. The terror of premature burial was rational given the medical knowledge of the time. It wasn't mass hysteria or cultural delusion. It was a logical response to real uncertainty. When medicine advanced enough to eliminate that uncertainty, the fear naturally faded. This suggests that many of our contemporary anxieties might similarly dissolve not through willpower or cultural change, but through advancing knowledge that makes the feared scenario implausible. What are our modern equivalents of the coffin bell? What elaborate systems are we building today to address fears that future generations might look back on as quaint? Perhaps our obsession with digital backup and cloud storage reflects a fear of losing our memories and identities. Maybe our focus on longevity research and life extension represents the same fundamental anxiety about death that drove people to install coffin bells. The specific fears change, but the underlying human need to assert control over mortality continues. The resolution of the premature burial fear also teaches us something hopeful. Some problems actually do get solved. Not all human anxieties are eternal and insurmountable. Sometimes technological progress, better understanding, and improved practices genuinely eliminate the source of fear, rather than just helping us manage it better. Our ancestors really were in danger of being misdiagnosed as dead. That wasn't irrational fear, it was rational concern. And now, through ECGs and embalming and systematic protocols, we've made it essentially impossible. The fear was real, and now it's not, because we changed reality. There's also something poignant about the fading of this fear. The people who installed coffin bells genuinely believed they might need them. They lay down in their coffins with strings attached to their fingers, hoping those strings would never need to be pulled, but grateful they were there. Every single one of those people is now long dead, and none of the bells rang for them when they needed it, because the bells never worked reliably. But the psychological comfort of having them installed was real and valuable in its own way. Sometimes the illusion of control is all we have, and maybe that's enough. The story of premature burial and coffin bells is ultimately a story about the strange, awkward relationship humans have with death. We know it's coming. We know it's inevitable. We know we can't prevent it. But we insist on trying to shape it, control it, understand it, and prepare for it anyway. We draw elaborate plans. We create rituals. We build devices. We write laws. We tell stories. All of this activity swirls around the simple, unavoidable fact that we will die, and we're terrified of getting it wrong. But perhaps getting it wrong isn't the real fear. Perhaps the deeper terror is facing death passively, as something that simply happens to us. The coffin bell, absurd as it might seem, represents active engagement with mortality. It says, "Even in death, I will not be silent. Even buried, I will still signal my presence. Even in the darkest moment imaginable, I will reach for connection with the living world." The bell might not work, but installing it is an act of defiance against the finality and loneliness of death. This is what we can carry forward from our ancestors who feared premature burial. The understanding that death anxiety isn't pathological or shameful, it's deeply human. The recognition that we cope with mortality through rituals and systems that provide psychological comfort even when they lack practical effectiveness. The awareness that our fears reflect the medical and cultural contexts we inhabit, and that changing those contexts can genuinely reduce those fears. And perhaps most importantly, the reminder that humans facing death have always insisted on maintaining some form of agency, some gesture toward control, some small assertion that even at the very end, we are still here, still conscious, still reaching out. The coffin bells are silent now. The safety coffins have become museum curiosities. The waiting mortuaries have closed. The fear that drove their creation has faded into history. But the human impulse they represented, to bridge the gap between life and death, to assert presence in the face of absence, to insist on being heard even from the grave, that impulse remains. It expresses itself differently now, in different technologies and rituals and anxieties. But it's the same fundamental aspect of what makes us human. We know death is coming, and we refuse to face it silently.